The Greek word for church is simply gathering. So if you think about it, gathering is whoever shows up, right? At least in the North American division, I don't know about anywhere else, we kind of go about it backwards. We start with a group, and then a company, and then a church, and it's all based on size, when actually we should call them churches, no matter how big they are, no matter. So speaking of church, the church should pray first, shouldn't they, though? Let's do that. Father, thank you for bringing us together again today. Always thank you for the time and the opportunity that you bring to us to enter into your presence. We thank you that you've called us into your presence. We are present in prayer and present in your word, and we want you to lift that word off the page. Make it live in us, make it breathe in us, so that we would truly enter into your presence this morning. And we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. I came to Jesus, came to church, came to ministry late in life for a lot of people. I wasn't baptized until I was 26. And I was actually won to Jesus in this conference through, I attended my first camp meeting as a heathen. You didn't detect me at the gate. Your heathen detector doesn't work. So I just walked right into the gate, a complete heathen. But my wife, and who still is the greatest witness that I've ever come across, brought me to Jesus. And I was baptized actually in the Glendale Church, but I was baptized in the Glendale Church BGM before Gary and Marilyn. And I think Gary can testify that the Glendale Church before him had a much, much different look and feel and sound to it, then. But I only spent a couple of years there. I was baptized in '86, and by 1990 I was packed up and moving to Angwin to study for the ministry. So I look at this introduction, and I wrote it the first time in a church, my last church pastoring before coming back to Arizona. And it was a church that had contemporary worship. So I'm looking at the lines that I'm using here, and it probably would ring different talking to this group. But when you're talking to a church that uses contemporary worship, sometimes there are people in that church that have been in there long enough that they don't even know what the hymnal is. Our church, we had our hymnals. We had every hymnal that we'd ever purchased back before we became contemporary, but they were in a cabinet in the conference room. And every now and then we would pull them out. We weren't averse to the hymnal, not at all. It's just that we kind of reworked the hymns to just make them a little easier to sing for a younger group. We had at least two hymns every Sabbath. It's just that they were kind of not the way they were arranged. So coming into the church, when I did in the 80s in a traditional church like Glendale, and the very first church that I pastored was a very traditional church, though it seems, after a while, it seems like an ancient, mysterious oracle, this hymnal, And even the members that still recall it fondly in a contemporary church, that's the way they refer to it. They even say it in hushed tones, the hymnal, But not being in the church that long, I always relied on the person in church, that sage that would walk us through the hymnal, that would work us through the hymnal, the one that would stand up every Sabbath and say, now turn in your hymnals to number. I relied on that person, I relied on the pastor to walk us through it. Well, now I'm pastoring, and I have one pianist in my first church. One. That's it, just one. And she always made me pick the hymn. I said, you don't want me picking the hymn? I know like 3 songs. And I like them all, and I'm just going to pick them over and over. But she said, no, Pastor, you must pick the hymn. You know your sermon. I want your hymn to go with it. I said, okay, all right. She held me to it. So it was hard for me to navigate this ancient scroll with its secrets and its codes. And I don't read music. And I'd pick a hymn sometimes, and she'd look at it and says, that has 4 sharps. I hate that. And I went, what's a sharp? I played one instrument my whole life. And prepare yourself. It was drums. There are no sharps and flats on drum music, back when I could even read drum music. So it was like navigating this ancient, scroll. But what was funny about Molly is that every now and then she would refer to another volume of Apocrypha. She would call it the Old Hymnal. And she would say it in revered tones.
My favorite song out of the new hymnal.
The Old Hymnal. And there was a reference, the way she, there's just this reverence, the way that she referred to it. And once she mentioned a hymn by Fanny Crosby that is not in the new hymnal. And it's called Someday the Silver Chord Will Break. And she told me it was a beautiful hymn to play for funerals. I think she was trying to help me out. We had a funeral coming up. Someday the silver cord will break, and I no more as now shall sing. But oh, the joy when I shall wake within the presence of the King. And I shall see him face to face and tell the story saved by grace. And I shall see him face to face and tell the story saved by grace. I don't know why they would leave that out of the new hymnal. Sounds kind of good to me. Okay, sounds kind of good to me. And I remember when she played it. But now I understand that the title of the hymn comes from Ecclesiastes. Someday the silver cord shall break. So when we began last Sabbath, we encountered some resistance. Always. We always encounter some resistance when we want to study the book of Ecclesiastes. And it's usually the people that have been in the church a while asking me, why are we studying the book of Ecclesiastes? Okay. And the first time that I ever did this in church, Walt and I both encountered this resistance. What's in it for us? What could possibly be in this book? Because Ecclesiastes is traditionally used at funerals. Even the words from Ecclesiastes are used in hymns that we only do at funerals. Okay. And we'll see today, there's a couple of lines in Ecclesiastes that we've only ever used as a proof text, right? For the state of the dead. Ecclesiastes is about death. It's about dying. It's about getting old. It's about life going on. It's about cradle to grave. It's about everything that is horrible under the sun. But I told you day before yesterday, I think we should be reminded of that. I think we should be reminded of it every day. I think we should bring God our under the sun condition every day and lay it at his feet. Because I truly believe that he's present. Truly believe that he's present even under the sun. If he's not, we might as well all pack it in right now. Join a club whose dues is a little less stiff. Because that's what a church becomes if we don't believe that God is present with us, even in our under the sun condition. Okay. So, after studying this far, would you conclude with me that maybe the book of Ecclesiastes isn't meant to depress us? That maybe it's meant to encourage us? It's just an honest, dead-on portrayal of life on this planet, living under the sun. It's not the book, it's not pointing it out, it's life itself that is depressing and demoralizing. That's what that's what no longer confounds the Koheleth. It confounded him when he was king, when he was trying to do something about it. It no longer confounds him. He's just telling you, this is what I found. And you're probably not going to find anything different. There are many, many Christians walking around out there that feel that if they're depressed, actually suffering from depression, that means that they are no longer faithful. Now I will tell you, in a crowd this size, you will encounter in any crowd over 12 people, you're going to encounter at least one person out of 10 who's suffering from depression right now. So the next time you're sitting in church, just count 10. And how many times will you count that and get the idea of how many depressed people are sitting in church and feeling that they are no longer faithful because they're depressed? I think Pastor Manny did a real good job talking about Elijah, because I think Elijah is a perfect example of what clinical depression can do to you, right? Elijah was strong. He was God's man. But here he sits in a cave and cannot see past the gloom. He cannot see past the darkness. That's clinical depression right there. Somebody who's clinically depressed, you cannot remind them how good life is. They know how good life is, yet still they feel this way and they don't know why. Well, I think Ecclesiastes is speaking to them. You don't have to feel good in order to be faithful. Somehow we've associated our faith with feeling good. And if we're only faithful when we're feeling good, well, living life under the sun means we're not feeling very faithful quite a bit of the time that we spend each day. So I think the book was written because there are things that need to be said about under the sun in our lives and our natures and our motives and the ruination that already is, that Solomon is just reporting to us. And it has to be said in order to come to the conclusions we need to come to. The principle of the book brilliantly illustrates how to get us there. The conclusion that we have to come to, it begins with a familiar theme. Solomon is saying, under the sun, what the theme is, what he's saying here. Turn that. And asking. And he says this, remember your Creator in the days of your youth before the days of trouble come and the years draw near when you say, I have no what? I have no pleasure in them. Okay. Now, I'm not one here to sit and say that we become more depressed and morose the older we get. Okay. I'm not saying that at all. I would say that I'm a little more cranky than I used to be. I would say that I'm a little more stubborn than I used to be. Okay. And Solomon is simply pointing these things out. What aging forces in us. What happens to us. I have no pleasure in them, he says. I have no pleasure in these days. Basically what he's telling us is that getting older really, really stinks. Okay? Compared to what it used to be, saying it really stinks. And then the Koheleth will do what he does so well. He will assemble his words to help us in our aging. I told you, if you're going to be told, okay, that getting old stinks, and by the way, we're all getting old, we might as well be told by a poet, right? Might as well let a poet tell us what it's like, right? So I'm going to go over some familiar words, but I want you, hopefully, we've painted a different picture. We've been together and we've been in this book for 4 days now. I want to, maybe you get a different picture of reading these familiar words, okay? Before the sun and the light and the moon and the stars are darkened and the clouds return with the rain. That's a very poetic way of putting it, right? A very, very poetic way of putting it. In the day when the guards of the house tremble, the strong men are what? Are bent. I'm not as tall as I used to be. I think for about a year in my life, my first go around in college, I was actually 6 feet tall. I've shrunk 2 inches. Where did that go? I also don't straighten up as fast in the morning. And bless their heart, I've got church members right now who don't straighten up at all anymore. Strong men are bent. The women who grind cease working because they are what? Because they're few. What's happening to the women who grind? They're not there anymore. And those who look through the window see what? See dimly. Okay? Our sight dims. I want you to imagine an ancient writer, an ancient poet commenting on health at the time, at some 1700 years BC, because that's what he's talking about. Our sight dims. We know today for a fact that cataract affects nearly 22 million Americans age 40 and older. Okay? By age 80, more than half of all Americans have cataracts. More than half. Now, the ancient world, there were very few people who made it to the age of 40. If they did, the likelihood of them getting things like cataract would then automatically equal growing what? Growing old. So that's what he's saying. What happens to their sight when they grow old? It grows dim, if you will. Okay? Dim. The next one, when the doors on the street are shut, the sound of the grinding is low, and one rises up at the sound of a bird, and all the daughters of song are brought low. Okay? Sound. What else is associated with aging? Hearing loss. Okay? Would you be surprised that hearing loss isn't always sometimes about volume? It isn't always about volume. It isn't always not being able to hear because of volume. It's about distinction of sound. Unfortunately, the easiest way to try to fix it is that technology has only come up with increasing the volume. Okay? How many here love their hearing aids? Nobody loves their hearing aids. I've never heard anybody say, I love my hearing aids. You know why? Because they're not addressing the problem. And it's not their fault. We just haven't come up with anything that can really get truly at hearing loss. We were all told inside of our ear there's 3 tiny, tiny little bones, right, that vibrate. And when they do, it sends a signal to the brain, and it's the bones that pick up the sound. The brain then interprets it. Well, what happens as we age is that those little bones, like every other bone in our body, begins to calcify. And pretty soon, they don't vibrate like they should, which means the brain can't interpret the difference between the sound. So distinction becomes more difficult, making it hard to hear against ambient noise. So what's happened is the background noise, especially in a church, becomes the same as the noise they're trying to pick up, and the brain can't distinguish it anymore. And all technology can do is turn up the volume. But when you turn up the volume, you also turn up the volume of what? Of every other noise. So the way he described it, you jump up alert at the sound of a bird. Why? Because all of a sudden the bird pierced, the sound just pierced right through, the wall, if you will. And it woke them right up. And then pretty soon all the ambient noise comes in and they can't hear anymore. It's not an easy thing. It's not an easy thing. I had a church member who told me that they had to quit coming to church because if all of a sudden somebody said something real loud, if all of a sudden a child broke out to cry or laughed or yelled, it would break through, and then after that, they couldn't hear anything anymore. So I love the way he describes it. If you're hard of hearing, how come you can wake up at the sound of the bird? Because every now and then, one's going to bust through. Diminished vision, diminished hearing, the march continues. When one is afraid of what? One afraid of heights. Terrors are in the road. Okay? All of a sudden, terrors are in the road. Why? Why? We can't navigate the way we used to. We trip over things we didn't used to trip over before. Or we're not able to stop the trip like we used to. The almond tree blossoms. I'm not sure what that one means, but the almond tree blossoms, the grasshopper drags itself along, desire fails because all must go to their eternal home, and the mourners will go about the streets. So where does the march end, by the way? It ends at the cemetery, is what he's saying. This is what we're marching towards, okay? Heights. I know what he's talking about. I used to love to dive. I didn't so much like to swim. I spent hours in a pool. I spent so much time in a pool. I would get out and I would have that gray chlorine fog over my eyes, that doesn't clear until like the next day. I had hair back then, and even though it was brown, it turned green every summer. I just let it burn my eyes, I let it burn my hair. I did not care. I was in the pool from 12 to 5 because the public pool opened at noon. I gave him my quarter, and I did not get out until my mom was standing at the gate yelling for me. But I didn't do it swimming. I did it diving. I was glad that I learned how to swim because that got me from the pool to the ladder. And then from the ladder to the high dive. High dive, low dive, it didn't matter. We had a standard, 3-meter high dive at our public pool. I loved that. I could dive off it. We weren't allowed to jump off it for some reason, but I could dive off it. I could do a 1.5. That was my signature dive, my 1.5, from 9 to 18. Then at 41, when I turned 41, I was privileged to be able to be in Hawaii. And we did that 12 falls thing in Maui. That if you've been there, there's this cascading falls and pools that go all the way down to the ocean. Starts up at a beautiful bridge up there. And the pools have people in it all the way down. I forget which pool we were in. I just knew we could hear the ocean. And there was a cliff that was no higher than that high dive, right there. Okay. And people were diving off it, and they were jumping off it and everything else. I went ahead and I climbed up, and I said, this is going to be a blast. And I got to the edge, and I could not bring myself to jump out. Because you needed to jump out just a little bit in order to miss the rocks below to be able to hit the water. In my head, I could not get the image out of missing. I couldn't get it out of my head. I'm going to run up to here, my foot's going to slip, and I'm going to go right into those rocks. When actually just momentum of jumping carries you out far enough, and I couldn't get it out of my head. I stood there for 30 minutes. And then I finally jumped off. I couldn't dive off. I used to do a 1.5 off that thing. Lake Patagonia down, had the same size cliff. I do a 1.5 off that baby, but I was 19. So I get this, right? Couldn't get the image. When I was a kid, I hate things that crawl. I'm not one of those kids who chased lizards. I would pretend to chase lizards, and even when I got to where I could catch one, I'd stomp on the ground to get it to run away, and I'd and yell at my friends, "Oh, I lost him, because there's no way I'm picking up that lizard." You know what I mean? So anything that crawls, can't stand anything that crawls. But when I grew up, you walk through tall grass in the summer, you just walk through, and the grasshoppers, what do? Boink, 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 boink. You come across a grasshopper that's doing this, something's up, right? Something's going on. So don't you love the way the poet puts it? They used to boink, boink. Now they drag themselves along. March winds down to our eternal home. Mourners go about the streets. And then comes the line we were talking about. Before the silver cord is snapped, the golden bowl is broken, the pitcher is broken at the fountain, and the wheel broken at the cistern. It's where it's going, right? It's where it's headed. Hang on just a second. Because we know, and this is the verse that we're most familiar with, and the dust returns to the earth as it was, and the breath returns to who? When that happens, we know what has occurred, right? What occurs when that happens? When the body goes back to the ground and the Holy Spirit goes back to God. We died. That's right. And that's why we know it. That's why we know it so well. Has anybody here never heard that verse before? And we know it why? It's our proof text. It's our proof text. We've used that proof text many, many times. We know we don't have eternal spirits of our own. What makes up the soul is the Creator forming a body and imbuing it with His Holy Spirit, giving it the force of life. He did all that. Life only comes from the Creator. The only thing the creature has is free will. And all the creature can do with his free will is choose what? Choose life. It's all what it comes down to. Moses, before sending the people into the Holy Land, he says, I hand you today life and death. It's right here. You don't have to go down to hell to bring it up. You don't have to go to heaven to bring it down. It's right here. Choose life, he says. Choose. Choose. Is it the truth? Our state of the dead message? How we've interpreted this? Is it the truth?
I don't know, but it doesn't really matter for salvation.
Well, I'm just saying, is it the truth? Yeah, it's the truth. Right. It's the truth. It's not a trick question. I'm not trying to trick you, okay? I'm not trying to trick you. Don't be ashamed of the truth. But however, there is something even about the truth under the sun. Something about the truth under the sun. Because Ecclesiastes reminds us that even the truth, even wisdom and the truth under the sun is what? Vanity. It's futile. And I'm hoping I'm going to address your comment. It's futile. The fact that there is a proof text, the fact that we have proof texts, even the truth under the sun is vanity. See, you have to get what the Koheleth is telling us. Even the truth of what we have or what we call truth under the sun becomes what? Vanity. Because sin's selfishness only sees and uses truth selfishly. We take the truth and we turn it into something else. I am getting to where I hate the words proof text. Because the very nature of a proof text means I've got something to prove you what? Wrong. Now, there is right and wrong. I'm not saying we alleviate between right and wrong, but I just want to talk about our natures and when it takes what is good and turns it into vanity. Just because it has the wrong motive. And on top of that, it covers up the motive because it appears to be something good. You with me? George Knight, I love what he told us once. He said, human beings are the only people that can sin by doing good. Martin Luther once said, take the most selfless, righteous, kindest, compassionate, good deed, act that you can think of, and God will forgive you for it anyway. We're the only creatures that can sin by doing good. Why? Because we do good for the wrong reasons. I want to remind you what Gary pointed out to us yesterday. And by the way, what he said is not just found with Elijah, not just found in the text that he took us, it's also in the Sermon on the Mount. You don't do good to find favor with God. Why? Because you already found favor with God. And the other reason we don't do it is to find favor with men. He says it in the Sermon on the Mount. You don't pray, you don't fast, you don't give for two reasons. Don't do it to find favor with God because you've already found favor with God. You've got to believe that. And as long as you believe that, that'll keep your motive straight. But if you're doing it to look good in front of other people, Jesus said, congratulations, you have your reward. But don't expect God to reward you. If you're doing it to look righteous to other people, congratulations. You will. You will. You've got your goal. But when God rewards, He rewards where? In secret. He doesn't even want us to why doesn't He want our left hand to know what our right hand is doing? Because we even do good for the wrong reasons. We either do it because we feel that we've got to get right with God, or we do it because we look better than somebody else. And by the way, if you don't feel that you're right with God, then you're always going to want to be around people who look worse than you do, because then you will look better to God. I thank you, O Lord, I'm not like that tax collector over there. So if it's only about the doctrine or the immortality of the soul, it becomes a debate of truth versus error. But really what it's about is the mercy of God. Death as the end of life, if you think about it this way. Death as the end of life as we know it is the most merciful thing that can be done for a creature who chooses not to live. What's waiting for somebody who doesn't choose God? Death. Which means what's waiting for them? Nothing. Zero. Are they suffering? Are they in hell burning forever? Some would say that the last thought that they have is whatever that scene is in Revelation, when the fire comes down and consumes them. No, guess what? You don't have a last thought anymore. Death might be the most merciful statement made about God. Amen? But we can and we have unmercifully preached truth. Like you said. All of a sudden it's now all about, I got to believe this or I won't be saved. And if I'm trying to believe the truth in order to make God save me, there's my motive, right? Walt, my buddy I told you about, he used to say that he thinks sometimes that we want to become perfect because if we do, then God has to save us. He does, doesn't he? If I become sinlessly perfect, He has to save me. And now we're back to exactly what Gary was talking about yesterday. A paganized Christianity, to where now we're even trying to control our living God. Remember what he taught us. Paganism, there's only one difference between paganism and worshiping the living God. In paganism, the worshiper is in control. We make God do what we want him to do. Worshiping the living God, he's in control. And he's decided for some reason to already find you in favor. For some reason, he's decided to already love us. While we were yet enemies, he died for us. If you have a problem with that, you're going to have to take it up with him, not me. We can use the truth for our own gain. Something to be better than someone else. Nothing trumps nature under the sun. Righteousness, self-righteousness, being good, performing good deeds, being the wisest man on earth and trying to apply that, nothing trumps our sinful nature. Nothing does. Creation has fallen so far that that even in being good, we can sin. Commit the sin of being good. I'll confess right now. Anybody ever committed the sin of being good? I have. Certainly I have. We can use something that is as beautiful as truth and use it for our own gain. Something to be better than somebody else. See, if I'm better than somebody else, then God will like me better. Okay? The pure truth, his doctrine. Listen to the teacher when he talks about truth and doctrine, okay? The teacher sought to find pleasing words, and he wrote words of truth, what? Plainly. I wrote it plainly. These sayings of the wise are like goads and like nails, firmly fixed are the collected sayings that are given one by a shepherd. What kind of truth is he talking about? He's talking about our scriptures. He wrote 3 books of these scriptures. And he says they're like nails and goads, which means what? They're fixed, okay? There's something to grab onto. All of a sudden, if my apartment is completely empty and there's nothing on the walls or the door, I drive a nail, just a nail, into the door. I now have a what? I have a fixed point. I have something that I can hang my hat. I can hang my coat. That's what he said. The truth is like that. Okay? Collected sayings, it's truth. Of anything beyond these, my child, beware. Of making many books, there is no end. And much study is a weariness of the what? He says, I gave pleasing words plainly. I gave wise words like goads. But anything beyond that, he says, beware. I'm not 100% sure. But let me look. It could be translated this way. But my child, let me give you some further advice. Be careful, for writing books is endless, and much study what? Wears you out. A further word against them, my son, be warned, the making of many books is without limit, and much study is a wearying of the flesh. Why? Because he said, I thought the answer was to get better truth. And the more truth I uncovered, the more it vexed me. Remember what he said? The more it vexed me. The more my wisdom vexed me. So he warns us. He warns us. Because remember what the book said about oppression yesterday. What do human beings do with beautiful things like truth and wisdom and power? What do we do with them? It's what he said. I'm sorry, I don't have that one up there, but because it's from yesterday. Again, I saw all the oppressions that are practiced under the sun. Look, the tears of the oppressed with no one to comfort them. Shouldn't you think that the people that understand truth should be the ones that are able to comfort other people? But what happens to us when we begin to use the truth for our own purposes? When we begin to use it to look better in front of God and to look better in front of each other? So under the sun, we're sinful, we're still self-centered, we're cruel by nature. The truth just becomes another tool we use to oppress. I know a woman, I wish I could say she was a friend. She's only been a teacher of mine a little bit here and there. I don't know if anybody knows Elaine Kennedy. She's a geologist. She worked for years and years at the Geoscience Research Institute at Loma Linda. I'm not sure where she's working now. But just a couple of years ago, I saw her on Dwight Nelson's TV show. And it's an interesting thing. It's hard. You think it's hard just walking the streets being a believing Christian or an Adventist. Try being a geologist. Because in the world of geology, if you even just hint that you may be open to a creator and creation and everything else, you are immediately a pariah and drummed out. I mean, I admire any Adventist scientist who's trying to walk that walk. And she did it for years. She did it for years. But she's looking back on a career now that spans 35 years as a believing geologist. And she said, something has become completely aware to me that I've spent my entire career debating other geologists about the reality of biblical creation. And also, by the way, a biblical flood. Okay? Which that's actually making inroads. Some form of hydrology, if you will, is beginning to make inroads into mainstream geology, but just a little bit of inroads. Still, if you're a believer, you don't publish as a believer. Once you publish as a believer, you won't be taken seriously as a geologist anywhere. So she said, I've spent my entire career debating secular geologists, debating. And she said, and this just got to me. She said, but I turned around the other day and realized I don't have any friends. I spent 35 years rubbing shoulders with colleagues, and none of them are my friends. She said, so what time I have left in this field, what time I have left on this earth, she said, I'm done debating. Because debate does nothing. Using the truth for our own gains. It's what we are. I want you to look at the history of the Christian church. Look at its reputation today. A few years ago, in a study actually underwritten by Tony Blair and somebody else, they were going to hold a conference, this World Peace Conference in Toronto. And what they wanted to know was whether or not the world actually believes that religion is a force for good. They polled 18,000 people amongst 14 nations with just that one question: is religion a force of good? Out of those 14 nations, only 6 said yes. And by a majority, including the U.S. at number 4, only one of them was 65%, were above 60%. And that was Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, and India. By far, the nations with the most and longest exposure to Christianity scored the lowest. What have we done with our truth? To where people, if you just ask them one simple question, is religion a force for good, they can't even say yes. I know. It's one poll. And I also don't believe that the world should dictate to us. But I don't take this as saying that the world is dictating to us. I'm thinking what the world is doing is showing us what we've done. That's what I love about Ecclesiastes. It's a look in the mirror for Solomon. It's a look in the mirror. And that's what we're reading when we read. As Christians, I don't know if we're going to make it right now with this. It's not a rabbit trail, but I want to try something, okay? As Christians, when you look at the war, if you will, between Samaritans and Jews, where do you fall? Who was it that was right in that war? As Christians, normally our knee-jerk reaction is we side with who? We side with the Jews, don't we? We side with Israel, quote unquote, Judah, if you will. All right, because Samaria actually is what's remaining of the 10 other tribes. Okay, the 11 other tribes after the split. But Judean Jews, by Jesus' day, are they getting along with the Samaritans? No. They hate each other. They absolutely hate each other. And I never thought of this before I read this book that took me through this. I never thought of this before. Did they hate each other because they were completely different? No. They hate each other because they were themselves. They're cousins, aren't they? Okay? Jesus, in John 4, it says that he's on a journey, and it says that he had to go through Samaria. Even John, 70 years later, is saying, I think we had to go through Samaria. You didn't. You didn't have to go through Samaria. You know what you could do? Add 2 days to your journey and walk around, which is what most every other Judean Jew would do. Walk around Samaria. Okay? To get where? Where was everybody going? Parable of the Good Samaritan. Where was he headed? Jericho. Okay? To get around Samaria to Jericho, to be able to trade, to be able to sell, if you will, to outside nations. Okay? It was a trade route. All right? So even John, in John 4:4 says, but he had to go through Samaria. You didn't have to. It was just convenient. Why would they go around? Because if they walked through Samaria, they would immediately become unclean until sundown. And some of them believed that you didn't even actually become clean after sundown, that the Samaritans were so vile, okay, that you actually needed more time. And they're like feuding stepchildren. They hated each other. Each claimed that theirs was the true way to worship God. They both had a truth. Each claimed that they had the mountain and the true temple of God. And we automatically side with who? We side with Judea, okay, right? Why? Have you ever heard the Samaritan's argument? Okay. What happened, though? What happened to them is, and I don't have time to go into it, but the monarchy is what did this to us. Okay, them. Okay, and the monarchy is what did to them. David and Solomon, everybody was together, right? As soon as Solomon dies, the nation splits. Okay, northern tribes, southern kingdom. Okay, northern tribes, southern kingdom, into two kingdoms. Okay, and I know for years and years and years, but when we think of the Samaritans, we immediately think idolatry, and a few other things come to mind. So it's easy to write them off because they simply are not worshiping right. They simply don't have the truth. But you can go along with me if you'd like. Just listen to this for just a minute and see what you think, okay? In John 4:6, it says that Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired out by his journey, was sitting by the well, and it's about noon. Jacob. Who's Jacob? What's Jacob's name, by the way? Shouldn't even be named Jacob anymore. God renamed him what? Israel. He's the very name of the nation itself. You know what Israel means in Hebrew? Wrestled with God and given the victory. Yitzrael, wrestled with God and given the victory. From now on, you'll no longer be known as lying little mama's boy. You'll no longer be known as the heel, okay, the subverter, the liar, the cheat. By the way, that's why God asked him to tell him his name. What's your name? And Jacob had to go, okay, I get it. I know. I've lied. I've cheated. Okay, I don't believe you. I didn't believe you. I've done everything my own way. I get it. Are you going to remind me of that today after the night we've had? I get it. I'm Jacob. He confessed, didn't he? And God said, no longer will you be known as Jacob. You'll now be known as Yitzrael. One who wrestles with God. One who has a face-to-face relationship. One who contends with God. And when it's all over, God will give you the victory. It's literally what his name means. That's his well. The woman at the well, it's his. He dug that. They were living about 250 feet from that well. It sits between two mountains, Gerizim and Ebal. Shechem, in the middle of Samaria, was the most important place of ancient worship. It was the first place Abraham was led by God as he was told in Genesis 12. It was the place where Jacob returned from Palestine to Mesopotamia as he was told in Genesis 33. Israel's first meeting place for worship in the land of Canaan took place on Gerizim and Ebal, according to Deuteronomy 11, Deuteronomy 27, and Joshua 8. In fact, according to Deuteronomy, Mount Gerizim is the Mount of Blessing. Do you remember? Moses was told to use the mountains to illustrate the difference between blessing and curse. In Deuteronomy 11:29, when the Lord your God has brought you into the land that you are entering to occupy, you shall set the blessing on Gerizim and the curse on Ebal. When you have crossed over the Jordan, these shall stand on Mount Gerizim for the blessing of the people: Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Joseph, and Benjamin. That's the mountain. Samaria's mountain. When the woman says, you Jews say we should be worshiping on the mountain in Jerusalem, we say we should be worshiping on this mountain. That's a pretty good argument, isn't it? They had strong biblical reason to believe that their mountain was the holy mountain. Also remember that Shechem was the place that Joseph was buried after the Exodus, according to Joshua 24. Plus, interesting to note that Joshua faced no opposition in the center of the land where Samaria is located. His greatest battles were in the north and the south. Archaeology has found an altar that predates the Exodus that says it's dedicated to the Lord of the covenant. Quite possible that Jacob left behind worshipers of the God of Israel when he moved to Egypt. So they have an ancient claim. Jerusalem doesn't become the center of Israelite worship until 1000 BC. By the time Shechem was the primary center of worship, by the time that happened, Shechem had been the center of worship of the living God of Israel for 1,000 years. So, let me ask you this. Why was it so easy for the northern tribes of Israel to reject worship at Jerusalem after the time of Solomon? Because maybe the animosity had just grown too much. And maybe the people that felt they had the truth had been hammering on them too long. See, we say that they're idolaters, that they're half-breeds, that they're idolaters. How did Samaria come about? Well, here's what happens. In 740 BCE, Assyria takes Samaria captive. Second Kings describes what happens next. This is in 1724. The king of Assyria brought people from Babylon, Cutha, Hava, Hamath, Sepharvaim, and placed them in the cities of Samaria in place of the people of Israel. They took possession of Samaria and settled in its cities. So one of the priests whom they'd carried away from Samaria came and lived in Bethel, and he taught them how to worship the Lord. See, the ancient kings lived by this idea that you could not worship a God not in the land that he gave you. So he may have repopulated Samaria after he took all of the Israelites captive. But he, in his mind, he said, I want the lands and the fields to be fertile for me. So they need to worship the God of the land that was there. So he gives them a priest. The hold that the land has on worship, it's absolutely amazing. Do you remember when Naaman was cleansed of his leprosy in the Jordan? What did he command his servants to do? To go get 2 cartfuls of dirt to take back with him. Because he wants to worship the God of Israel, but he can't picture doing it without the land that God gave Israel. And it says here, but every nation still made gods of its own, put them in the shrines of the high places that the people of Samaria had made, every nation in the cities of which they lived. So these nations worshiped the Lord, but also carved their images. Boom, there you go, idolaters. Look at that, they're all idolaters. That's why Judeans hate Samaritans, because they're idolaters. But what are we leaving out here? Samaria has been told by Judah by Jesus' day for years, for thousands of years, that we hate you because you're idolaters. And by the way, since you're an idolater, it's clear that Scripture says God hates you too. So if God hates you, then we can too. And they've been reminding them that of years, for years and years and years. But what do they leave out? Is that 135 years after the Assyrian captivity of the northern kingdom, what happened to Judah? They were hauled into captivity in Babylon. And why were they hauled into captivity in Babylon? Because they worshiped other gods. By the way, not everybody in Judah was hauled into captivity in Babylon. A lot of them stayed. And when they did, they also repopulated in the north. They stayed in Palestine just south of the Samaritans. The ones who did were reformed under the teachings of Daniel and Ezekiel and Ezra. So when they returned from captivity, the Judeans, and they come and all of the Samaritans and everybody's still there, they're actually truly shocked. The people that are still there, that all of a sudden these Judeans returning from captivity are treating them like idolaters. They come back from captivity, they believe they're reformed, and they go back into Israel, and they tell everybody that's living there, you are idolaters and you're hated by God. And they would be reminded of their history. I think the Samaritans were stunned by this because they felt that for the years that they were in captivity, they were the ones reflecting the true worship of God. After 100 years, they gave up trying to work with the others, and they went ahead and built their own temple on Mount Gerizim. After 200 years after it was built, John Hyrcanus, a Jewish leader, destroyed it. And this is about 200 years later is about the time that Jesus comes across this woman. The two groups generally have hated each other. They won't have anything to do with each other. By Jesus' day, Jews felt the Samaritans defiled everything they touched. By the way, if you look all through the law, there isn't anything in the law that makes you unclean. Another living person does not make you unclean. The only thing of a human that makes you unclean is a dead one. Okay? But Jews somehow interpolate that they're unclean while they're living, which is why nobody will walk through Samaria. So they were able to take their truth and religiously hate them. They're detestable. And talk about not listening to prophets. Ezekiel 16 says to Judah, your elder sister is Samaria. By the way, when Ezekiel speaks to them, they're still in captivity. Ezekiel is the captivity prophet. He's sent to the people in captivity for them to know that God has not abandoned them. You're not in the land anymore, but God is still with you. Ezekiel's presence as a prophet is that. But he tells them this while they're in captivity. Your elder sister is Samaria, who lived with her daughters to the north of you, and your younger sister, who lived to the south of you, is Sodom with her daughters. You not only followed their ways and acted according to their abominations within a very little time, you were more corrupt than they in all your ways. Samaria has not committed half the sins you've committed. Wonder where they buried that little scroll. For years when they were trying to make Samaria their scapegoat. You've made your sisters appear righteous by all the abominations that you've committed. So what, right? Look what two groups of people did to each other over the truth. Philip Yancey puts it this way. Jesus came from the Father full of grace and truth. The church has worked tirelessly on the part of truth, witnessed the church councils and the creeds and the volumes of theology, denominational splits over minor points of doctrine. I yearn for the church to compete just as hard in conveying what God calls the incomparable riches of God's grace. I aim, if you will, that we become perceived more as grace dispensers than truth dispensers. Jesus is saying that the truth is nothing if you're not full of what? If you're not full of grace. Grace equals truth, and that's all. And by the way, something must have happened. Because in Luke 9, Jesus' disciples are ready to call fire down on a Samaritan village because they won't be hospitable to them. That's the last time we see the opinion of Jesus' disciples, is that version there. And by the way, when they come back, why did Jesus send them into town anyway to buy food while he talks to this woman? Because he knows what they're going to do when they come back out. As a matter of fact, they won't even come near her. They come and they see him talking to her, and they're immediately mortified. And they stay at a distance, and they say, Master, come here and get something to eat. So that's the last time we leave the disciples. But in Acts 15, It says, after Paul and Barnabas had no small dissension and debate with them, Paul and Barnabas and some of the others were appointed to go up to Jerusalem to discuss this question with the apostles and the elders. And you know what the question was? How in the world can how can we let these Samaritans into the church? They were idolaters. And they were sent by their way to the church. They passed through both Phoenicia and Samaria, and they reported the conversion of the Gentiles and brought great joy to the believers. The Samaritans were converted. Here the Jewish Christians are arguing in Jerusalem whether or not you can be saved without being circumcised. Paul and Barnabas happened to walk through Samaria, and when they walk through Samaria, they find all of Samaria converted. Why? Because the one Jew full of grace and truth stopped at a well one day and told a woman who had no inkling that God loved her that he did. And the woman went and told her village. And then in Acts 8, Peter and John testify and spoken of the word that after they returned to Jerusalem, they went out to proclaim the good news to many villages and Samaritans. They were calling down fire on it just a few months ago. And now by the power of the Holy Spirit and by what God has done with them, now they're evangelizing them. And Paul and Barnabas said, guess what, guys? It happened. It happened. I have respected teachers and friends who have to defend their reputations on their Facebook pages every day because they're suffering wounds from people of a church bearing the same name. So what does it leave us with? The end of the matter. All has been heard. Fear God and what? And keep his commandments, for that is the whole duty of everyone. And of course, the Koheleth that comes after the Koheleth told us what that meant to keep his commandments. Love God, love your neighbor as yourself. And if you want to argue with who your neighbor is, remember Jesus told the lawyer, the Samaritan's your neighbor. The lawyer couldn't even say the word when he was done, when he said, who was it that was a neighbor to the man who fell among thieves? And the lawyer says, there was a movie that I saw, an animated movie. I think he did a brilliant job. The lawyer goes, it was the man who showed mercy to him. Jesus says, go and do likewise. There's a madness to this. God will bring every deed into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil. And that should instill fear in us. Because look what it's done to the Koheleth. He's brought every good and evil deed and wrote it down on Ecclesiastes and brought it to his God. Fortunately, God said, Solomon, I hope you don't mind, but I'm going to have every believer eavesdrop on this conversation for the rest of humanity. I want to show them what it means when you bring your true self to me, when you bring your good and your evil deeds to me. I want to show them what it means when you come to me that way so that they can experience forgiveness, so they can experience atonement, so they can get up and walk away and know that they've passed from condemnation to eternal life. Ellen White said in the Ministry of Healing, no other influence that can surround the human soul has such power as the influence of an unselfish life. The strongest argument in favor of the gospel is a loving and lovable Christian. Doing good to try to please God eventually turns us into very mean people. And we do some very mean things when we do. Doing good to look good in front of everybody else also turns us into very mean people. See, because if I want you to believe that I'm self-righteous, then I have to continue to make myself look righteous. And now all of a sudden, the people that I'm looking good in front of that makes me feel good because God likes me better than you, if you ever find your way in here, so now you become my enemy. So serving God any other way will always turn us into mean people. And we never evangelize. We then use truth as a way to make people feel bad. We use truth as a way to feel better about ourselves. We turn it into a debate rather than a life-giving relationship. And we don't win anybody. So this is what I learned from the book of Ecclesiastes. Solomon's telling us exactly who we are and what to do with it when we find out who we are. He went to God. Thankfully, we even have an even easier path to God. His name is Jesus. We have nothing to fear. Nothing to fear. That's why our righteousness has to be by faith and faith alone. If we still find it hard, if we still find it difficult, then it's a faith problem. Not a strength problem, not a wisdom problem, not a truth problem. So the end of the matter is this. With Jesus, there is no end. And we can choose. So thank you all for taking this journey with me. When you get home and it's time, in your devotions and you get up to the book of Ecclesiastes, I hope you'll find it a blessing this time through this year. Okay. Thank you again. It's really, really a beautiful thing to see you every year. I love being with you. And so, let's pray. Father, thank you for your word. We thank you for bringing us together today. Lord, I trust and believe that you always have us to think about who we are and what we do and why we do what we do. So as always, I ask for this family here that you keep them safe and you bring them in and you clasp them around. You keep them from evil, you keep them from harm, and you keep them from temptation and draw them ever closer to you. And help us simply to walk as we know we should walk, to believe as we know we should believe. And most of all, to love as we know we should love, because you have loved us. We thank you for your grace and for your truth. And we ask this all in Jesus' name.